good morning, everybody. I just got to start off telling you something that I know is automatically some of you are not going to like me. If you did before, you're not going to now, because I just have a confession. Like, I hate garage sales. Like, I'm just telling you. Do we have any do you like hardcore garage sale people, like some of you? Yeah. I'm glad there's not that many of you. So the first crowd, there was like everybody. They were planning a coup, I think. Anyway, I just don't like them. It's not my thing. It goes back into my childhood trauma, which I'm not going to get into. But I was a few years ago. I was riding my motorcycle one day, and there was a garage sale over here. And again, I don't normally stop at them, but something caught my eye. I don't remember what it was, but I stopped and went to this garage sale. And again, I don't remember what I went there for, but I remember what I saw sitting on a table. And there was this old board game that intrigued me. I found out that it came out in the 50s, a game by Parker Brothers, presumably for church families, endorsed by church leaders, it said, and it's called Going to Jerusalem. Going to Jerusalem. Now, the price was an astronomical $3 they were asking for this. In good garage sale fashion, I tried to get them down to $1. They wouldn't budge, so I passed on it. But I was curious about it, so I did some research on it. And in this game, Going to Jerusalem, you got to be one of the disciples, and you were represented by a plastic little man with a robe, a beard, some sandals, and a staff. And in order to move across the board, how the game was played, you had to look up answers in this little black New Testament that came with the game. And you started out always in Bethlehem, and then you made stops along the way. You went to the Mount of Olives and Bethsaida and Capernaum and all these places. And if you rolled the dice really well and you got all the way to the end of the game, you ended up in Jerusalem for the triumphal entry, Palm Sunday, right? And here's the interesting thing, though, that's where the game ended, Palm Sunday, right? And that's where it ended. You never got to the crucifixion. You never got to the Last Supper. You never got to Golgotha, right? It just ended at the crucifixion. Now you made your way in this game only through the nice stories. It was a safe adventure, perfectly suited for a 1950s Christian family on a lovely Sunday afternoon walk with Jesus, right? But as we get in this series, as we started, the journey of Jesus was a via crucis, is what it was. It was a way of the cross, the way of suffering. Via crucis is just the Latin term for the way of the cross. In Spanish, they would call it the Via Dolorosa. And to stop the game with the triumphal entry on Palm Sunday, that obscures the whole reason, right, why Jesus made that trip in the first place. And it certainly obscures the fact that as Christ followers, you and I, we are to walk the way of the cross as well. Right? Didn't Jesus told us, take up your cross daily and follow me. But not only that, when they stopped at Palm Sunday, not only did they skip the crucifixion, but they skipped the resurrection. And that's like the whole point of everything, right? Paul said, I'm teaching you I'm passing on to you what's of first importance, that Jesus Christ crucified, and then he rose from the dead. And so that just kind of confounded me as a pastor. Now, I'm going to be straight with you. Today, as we begin the series, we're going to start off with a history lesson. Now, I understand some of you don't like history. The first crowd, they made it through just fine, okay? But it's so important to know what's going on around Jesus at this time, to understand why these people are doing the things that they're doing. But again, I get that some of you might not like history. I just mentioned the word history, and your eyes are getting sleepy, right? Your eyelids are getting heavy, and like I understand that. Not everybody loves history like I loved history. Not everybody loves school like I love school, but I just happened to come across these. I thought this was pretty funny. And these little quizzes, answers to quizzes students gave, young students. One of them, what ended in 1896, 1895, right? That's a good one. Probably not what the teacher was looking for, but it's pretty good. I love this. This one's a spelling test, right? Notice the only word that isn't spelled right. It's number 24. It's illiterate. Like, that's funny stuff, people. Come on, right? There was one other question, and this may have been how you felt about school, right? This next one. How do you feel about school? Hell, right? It's hell. Now, some of you, that may be your opinion of school. If you're offended by that word, I want to tell you that the next question was, write one word that describes our history class, which is the class that this was in. That was a worse word. I can't put that one up there, but they did not like history, evidently, and I understand that not everybody does. But I need you to be patient with me. I need you to track with me because this is so important to understand as we start our journey with Jesus. All right, I'm going to go all the way back to 334 BC. In 334, somebody said, wow, yeah, that's a long time ago, right? Hey, what came right after never mind. So, Alexander the Great, you may have heard of him in 334 BC. He launches this series of military campaigns against what was called the Great Persian Empire of Darius III. And eventually, Alexander the Great, because he was great, he eventually conquered all of that land and had this huge, big, unprecedented in the world up until that point, this big, huge area that he was in charge of. And after 10 years, he did that. In 323 BC, Alexander the Great, he fell ill and he died. And so, as often happens when that happens, his vast empire was left to be fought over by his generals and associates and friends. And so you had all these little skirmishes and battles taking place. And so, for example, to the north of Israel, one of Alexander's generals by the name of Seleucus, he founded the Seleucid Empire. Another general named Ptolemy, he took control further south of Egypt and North Africa. But if you look at that, what's that country that's right between them? That's Israel, right? And so Israel, the little tiny nation of Israel, got caught in this tug of war between these huge superpowers. And for the next 150 years, those two large countries fought back and forth to gain control over Israel, because if you controlled Israel, you would have the best place to launch an attack on the other side. So around 175 BC, there was one of these Seleucid kings. His name was Antiochus Epiphanes, all right? Antiochus Epiphanes. And he conquered Israel, and he also went on to conquer Egypt. And that's when, under Antiochus Epiphanes, this guy, that's when what we call the atrocities in Israel began. Antiochus Epiphanes, he sent his army to loot the temple, to carry away its treasures. He made it illegal for anybody in Israel to practice their religion, and they were forced to leave their Jewish customs, and he was trying to force them to sacrifice to the Greek false gods. Antiochus knew that if he could get them to worship false gods, he would be able to then set up his reign throughout the entire land. So the Israelites were forced to worship Zeus. There were all kinds of atrocities going on around there. Worst of all, there was a pagan statue erected in the temple in what we call the Holy of the Holies. Now, this was the inner sanctum of the temple where God himself was meant to dwell, the Ark of the Covenant. And they sacrificed a pig in the Holy of Holies of the Jewish temple. And pigs, of course, were considered most unclean animal of all by the Jews, and it was slaughtered right there. Masses of Jewish people abandoned their religion. They did, and they became pagan Greeks because they were afraid of getting killed. And Jews were killed on the Sabbath because they refused to fight. They refused to fight on the Sabbath. All of these things together, especially the Holy of Holies, the book of Daniel calls these acts the abomination that causes desolation. The abomination that causes desolation. This is what that verse is referring to. The abomination that causes desolation. Now, there were many faithful Jews who did not bow their knee to the pagan people. And one of them was a priest. His name was Matthias. And he was a priest. He lived with his 5 sons outside of Jerusalem. One day, soldiers, they came to his village. And they demanded Matthias to come forward in front of everybody and to offer worship to a pagan idol. Matthias was the leader. They knew that if he did it, everybody else would follow suit. Yet he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do it. But yet somebody else from that village, another Jewish person, stepped forward and offered worship to that pagan idol. And when that person did, Matthias the priest saw this. He grabbed a sword and he killed that guy right on the spot. And then his 5 other sons slaughtered all the soldiers. And this began what's known as the Maccabean Revolt. The Maccabean Revolt. His son Judah, Matthias' son Judah, led this insurgency. And he was given, because he was so fierce, Judah was given the name Maccabee, which just meant the hammer. Judah the hammer. And for the next 7 years, Judah Maccabee and all the people, they went on raids. They set traps. They set decoys, all these battles. And eventually they overthrew the Seleucids, killed all the collaborators. They took their country back. They tore down all the pagan shrines. They rededicated and cleansed the temple. And it was once again of Yahweh's. And then they did this. They lit what's called a menorah. And you've probably seen a menorah. It's just a kind of a curvy candle-looking thing. And they lit that thing. And even though there was only enough oil to keep that candle burning for a day, miraculously, that oil in that menorah lasted for 8 days. 8 days. And so Jewish people during Jesus' time and all the way till today celebrate that revolt and the miracle of this oil lasting 8 days. And it's called the Festival of the Lights, or Hanukkah. Now, I go through all of this to make this point. The Jewish people who would not buckle by forced conversion under the Greeks during this time, the people who stayed faithful to Yahweh, they were called the Hasidim. The Hasidim, or the pious ones. We get the word Hasidic Jew from this. The Hasidim, the pious ones, were the Jews who faithfully observed kosher food laws, circumcision, and obeying the Sabbath. They were the heroes at that time who were willing to die rather than lose their entire way of life and bend the knee to pagan gods. And that was a great thing. But eventually, these people, and more importantly, their kids and their grandkids and their great-grandkids, became the people who eventually, 2 centuries later, wanted to kill Jesus. See, because Jesus, just like the Greeks, threatened their very well-established way of life. The Hasidim, the heroes, the maintainers of the faithful Jewish practice, we know them today by, as Jay introduced us to, the Pharisees. This is where the Pharisees come from. And so we begin the series today, Via Crucis. Again, Latin for the way of the cross. And what we're going to do for these next 4 weeks leading up to Easter, we're going to follow Jesus on his journey to the cross. And we're going to look at why it was that people wanted to kill Jesus. And along the way, we're going to talk about the journey that God is calling each of us to as his followers and as his disciples. And we're going to be taking this journey from the book of Matthew. Now, we're going to have the scriptures up on the screen, but I would really encourage you to bring your own Bible or get your Bible app on the phone or whatever. I'd really like for you to follow along on your own. But again, it will be on the screens if that's better for you, at least for today. But we're going to start in Matthew chapter 12. Now, in Matthew 12, please, everything that I just told you, right? That's like, as they would say in history, that's going to be on the test, right? Not that there's a test, but you always ask the teacher, is this going to be on the test? Teachers loved that question, didn't they? Like they loved when students asked that question. Well, that was all very important to understand this. That in Matthew 12, Jesus tells 2 back-to-back stories of encounters between Jesus and between these Pharisees, these religious leaders, over, of all things, the Sabbath. And this is the first time that Jesus went from being a popular teacher to people just foaming at the mouth to kill him. And so in Matthew 12, verse 1, begins this way. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry and began to pick some heads of grain and eat them. And when the Pharisees saw this, they said to him, "Hey, look, your disciples are doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath." Unlike today, back then roads went right through fields. They didn't go around them. And so Jesus and his disciples, they're going through this field, and all they would have to do when they're hungry is reach down and to pick some grain and some dates and whatever else they could find. And really that's what the edges of the fields were for people to be able to do that. And this is what they do on the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath, just as it is today, begins sundown on Friday night, the Jewish Sabbath, sundown Friday night to sundown on Saturday, 24-hour period. And that Jesus and his disciples were doing this on the Sabbath absolutely drove the Pharisees nuts. They felt it was wrong. So I love what Jesus said. He shot back. He said, there are 2 times in the Bible when people broke the Sabbath because they were hungry, and God didn't freak out about it. And so in verse 3, it says he answered, "Haven't you read what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He entered the house of God, and he and his companions ate the consecrated bread, which wasn't lawful for them to do, but only for the priests. Or haven't you read in the law that the priests on the Sabbath duty in the temple desecrate the Sabbath, and yet they are innocent?" In other words, hey guys, there are stories, Jesus said, of good Jewish people, David of all people, and a priest who broke the Sabbath, and that didn't make them bad people. But then Jesus utters absolutely shocking, actually it would have been absolutely blasphemous for him to say these things. He said this, "Hey, listen, I tell you that something greater than the temple is here. And if you had known what these words meant, I desire mercy, not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent. For the Son, and this is it, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." Now, we've probably heard this story and those lines maybe so many times that it just kind of glides right over us. But here's the deal that you need to understand, all right? If you were a Jewish person and your parents or your grandparents remembered stories told by family members from long ago about this Maccabean Revolt against the Seleucids who were forcing the Jews to abandon their customs, to forsake God, and people died because they would not fight on the Sabbath, what would you have thought about what Jesus said? I mean, their family members, their ancestors were willing to die over this issue of the Sabbath. What do you mean you're Lord of the Sabbath? You're greater than the Sabbath? I'm sure they were thinking, only God is greater than the Sabbath. He's the one that gave it to us. And Jesus, you're saying that you're greater than the temple, the place where God actually lives? Listen, if you were a faithful Jew and you heard Jesus say these things, I guarantee you would probably be thinking, kill that blasphemer. See, keeping a Sabbath was one of the 10 commandments, right, given by God to Moses. Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, Exodus chapter 20. Sabbath, just a Hebrew word that means Shabbat. It literally means to stop what you're doing, normal life, and to focus on worshiping God. But the real question that people wrestled with after this Maccabean Revolt and before Jesus was born was, what does it mean to keep the Sabbath holy? What does it mean? Yes, it says you're not supposed to work, but what constitutes work? About 100 years before Jesus was born, there was a group of pious ones, a group of Hasidim, and they wrote some books. And these books are not considered inspired scripture. They're not in our Bibles, but they're very instructive. And one of the persons wrote, as they're trying to expand on what these laws mean, the book of Jubilees says this: "You shall do no work on the Sabbath day. Only what you have prepared for yourselves on the 6th day shall you eat and drink. And any man who does any work on the Sabbath day or goes on a journey, the man who does any of these things on the Sabbath shall die." So you see what they did. On Saturdays during the Sabbath, you're not allowed to prepare food because that would be work. And so you've got to make all the food for that 24-hour period, the Sabbath. You've got to make all of that on Friday morning or the day before. But that's how you keep the Sabbath holy. And see, what they did was they added a rule. They added a man-made rule to a principle that God had laid down. Honor the Sabbath. See, and then they put all kinds of rules and stuff on it. And so Jesus and his disciples, in their minds, they were breaking religious custom by grabbing this food in the fields. And just like the traders who wouldn't keep the Sabbath during the revolt, Pharisees said, they need to die for that. Why are you able to do that? And good Jews were fanatical about their Sabbath observance, just as practicing Jews are still today. Well, in verse 9 in Matthew, Jesus shares another story of the Sabbath. It says, now, okay, going on from that place, Jesus went into their synagogue, and it says, a man with a shriveled hand was there, looking for a reason to bring charges against Jesus. They asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now, in the first century, understand that everybody, almost everybody, made a living, fed their families, fed themselves by working with their hands. And so for a guy to have a shriveled hand that was of no use to him, that would have been absolutely horrible, would have been a cruel situation to live with. And so Jesus, he tells a story. We've heard it before, but he said to them, hey guys, talking to the Pharisees, if any of you has a sheep and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will you not take hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Hey guys, if your livelihood, if your sheep fell into a pit, like, wouldn't you pull it out on the Sabbath? Of course you would, said Jesus. But not the people who lived through the Maccabean Revolt. There was another group of people, even during that Maccabean Revolt time, who said that the reforms of Judah Maccabee are not enough. And so they wanted to be even more pious and more righteous and more holy than those people. So they went into a desert and they lived among themselves, and they were called the Dead Sea Community. And we've heard about this because of the things called the Dead Sea Scrolls that they have found. And the Dead Sea Scrolls contain lots of copies of the Scripture, but they also have a lot of other things. Again, man-made rules that people have written. So in one of these, called the Damascus document, listen to what it says. It says, no man shall walk abroad to do business on the Sabbath. He shall not walk more than 1,000 cubits beyond his town. No man shall eat on the Sabbath day except that which is already prepared. He shall eat nothing lying in the fields. No father shall carry a child while coming and going on the Sabbath. No man shall assist an animal to give birth on the Sabbath day. And listen, if it should fall into a cistern or a pit, he shall not lift it out on the Sabbath. Jesus said, hey, you would surely lift an animal out of a pit, even if it was the Sabbath. But the good Jews, the Pharisees, said, no, we wouldn't do that because that would be work. And then Jesus uttered, I'm convinced, he uttered two theologically profound words. That's stupid. Like that is just the dumbest thing I've ever heard of, right? I mean, look at what he says in verse 12. How much more valuable is a person than a sheep? Therefore, it's lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Let's use some common sense here, guys. And then it says, he said to the man, stretch out your hand. So he stretched it out, and it was completely restored, just as sound as the other one. And then here it is, verse 14. But the Pharisees went out, and they plotted how they might kill Jesus. How they might kill Jesus. This is the very first time in the Gospel of Matthew, and probably the very first time in general, that people are openly talking about killing Jesus. This was a man, they were convinced, who was not only blasphemous, but he, more importantly to them, he posed a threat to their way of life. As Pharisees, he posed a threat to their livelihood. He's got to be done away with. Say, well, okay, what? Okay, Chris, whatever. Two things I want you to keep in mind today, based on everything I've said, and as we go forward through the rest of this series. A couple applications, and the first one is this: that Jesus hates it when people go through religious motions. He hates it when people go through religious motions out of rote because they're trying to look more superior or spiritual than everybody else. And some of you that are here today, or some of you watching, maybe you came from such church backgrounds where everything was just kind of you were told to stand up or sit down or say this or memorize this or repeat that or don't do this or only read this kind of Bible, or all kinds of things that listen, people make up and saddle upon people. And maybe if that was you, like so many others, as soon as you maybe finished a class or you were baptized, you just got out of that church and never looked back at all, because it was all about rituals, going through the motion, and that is just not what Jesus was about. It was, however, what the Pharisees were about. The Hasidim, the pious ones. They had it measured out to the most finite detail, the exact religious behaviors that you needed to do. But there was no heart in it. There was no connection to God. And frankly, they were good with that. They didn't care. There's no heart in it. And so what we learn in this first passage leading to the cross is that Jesus was eventually killed because he wanted us to know God. Not just know about God, but to have a personal, real relationship with God. Not just know about God. And that leads to the second thing I want to say, and that is simply, we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful, and I say this to myself as a pastor, as a religious leader. We've got to be very, very careful that we don't create a rule when God taught a principle. God says, hey, keep the Sabbath holy because I rested on that day. Keep the Sabbath holy. That was a principle. There was a reason why God didn't give a long list of rules and do's and don'ts about how actually to do that. He was saying, hey, you use your judgment and how you keep it holy. Here's the principle. You decide what works for you. That is the principle. And actually, a lot of Jesus' teaching, were principles. They weren't rules. Now, don't get me wrong. There are clear teachings in the Bible that are very clear about what we're to do and not do and all. But a lot of it was principles that people take and they put stuff on it. They add stuff to it. We're to absolutely obey. He is our Lord. But how sometimes these principles, how we go about obeying them is sometimes left up to us. And yet religious leaders, pastors, we want to put more rules on things, right? And again, some of you might come from churches or have a background where you were hurt. Quite frankly, you were hurt because religious leaders like Pharisees and like pastors sometimes created all of these rules that you needed to follow. And there were rules that they weren't necessarily in the Bible, but if you colored out of the line, you were just an outsider. And there are all kinds of rules like this. We do it all the time. And I want to say to you, and I've said this before, and I truly mean it. It's something that because I talk to a lot of people, and if you grew up in a situation, or if you were part of a church, and I'm sure listen, we are not innocent of this. I understand that as a church, but if you were made to feel less than because you did something that some church leader said you should do or shouldn't do, and you've been made to feel like, listen, God must be done with me. I'm too far gone. I want to say that I am so, so sorry. On behalf of Jesus, I'm sorry that you were made to feel like that based on some rules that men decided to put on stuff. All kinds of rules. There's a lady, there's a lady named Cheryl Strayed, and she wrote a book called Brave Enough, and she speaks of her growing up in such a religious environment, and she wrote a book, and this is what she said. She said, we're entitled to our own opinions and religious beliefs, but we are not entitled to make up junk and then use the junk we make up to oppress other people. She doesn't say junk, that's why I blacked it out, but you can use your, but this is what Jesus is trying to get across. Why do you put stuff upon people that I never meant to put on people? But listen, Christian history is littered with stories of people who, once they became a majority, became the oppressors, who created rules to obey rather than principles to follow. And I can just tell you, they're all over the church. They're all over the Christian world. People they apply principles to themselves and their families, and that's fine. But listen, they apply it to everybody else as well. I guess I won't get sick of it because it happens every year, but every year I get questions. Chris, is it okay if if Christian kids go trick-or-treating? Is it okay if we have Halloween at our house? We like to decorate our house, or all kinds of things. If you're a good Christian, you shouldn't let your kids read Harry Potter books, or you shouldn't go to certain movies, or you shouldn't play cards, or you shouldn't go to dances, or women should only wear pants, or you can only read one version of the Bible. All kinds of rules. I was at a camp one year. And it was a Christian camp, and I was faculty there. And the dean, he took a principle of, let's dress with modesty, and he put a lot of rules on it. All right. Now, I understand he's a dean, he can do that, but he was absolutely obsessed with the length of the girls' shorts. Seriously. He had the rule, I think it was that the girls' shorts could be no shorter than an inch above their knee. And that is all he talked about. Every day, he would have all the girls stand up. He would look at their shorts. I am not making this up. You cannot make this stuff up. So all he talked about all week, the length of the girls' shorts. All the boys, they got on board. They were going to go around and offer to measure all the girls' shorts. It was just this ridiculous stuff. And it became so distracting. But we make up rules. We make up rules. Listen, if you grew up you'll appreciate this. This is absolutely true. All right? Again, you can't make this up. When I first heard it, when the person first told me, I doubted it. I'm like, no, come on, you're making that up. It's a great story, and I'll probably tell it, but I want to know if it really happened or not. He says, no, Chris, I promise you this is it. So he told the story of his two aunts. For lack of a better word, I was going to say they were, spinster aunts. They never got married. They lived together, and they grew up in a religious environment where you didn't play cards. You just didn't do that. Only problem was they loved to play cards. And that was one of the only things that they did that they enjoyed. And so I don't know what game it was, rummy maybe or something, I don't know, but they loved to play cards, and yet they felt so guilty about it. So this is how they decided to kind of assuage their conscience. So they would play cards, but when it came to shuffling the cards, they felt like shuffling the cards was too cardy looking. I don't know. So what they would do was, to shuffle the cards, they would throw the cards in a mixing bowl, and then they would take some utensils, and they would kind of like they're tossing a salad. They would, mix up the cards. And somehow that made it okay for them. Now, listen, whatever. But here's the problem. When that Camp Dean, when we start taking rules that really we're applying to ourselves, and that's great, but when we start measuring other people's religiosity by the rules that we have created for ourselves, that's when we run into a problem, and it just becomes all mixed up. And see, Jesus hated this because he saw firsthand how rules were used to hurt people. Again, please understand some clear things in Scripture as his people we need to do or not do. But listen, we're talking about these rules that almost become gospel in the Christian community. I had a whole list of them. I could go on and on about things that have been this way in the Christian church. But listen, Jesus hated those rules because those rules were used to hurt people. Those rules were used to almost keep a man from earning a livelihood because you can't heal somebody on the Sabbath. And so eventually, understand what got Jesus killed is this, that he stood up. And he said, hey, all of your rules, including the Sabbath, especially the Sabbath, I am the Lord of the Sabbath. And I want to have a relationship with you. I'm not interested in a religion with things that you do or don't do and rules and regulations and outward show. I want a real relationship with you, an inner relationship, 24/7, the type of relationship where we can feel him in our lives, where we know that he's real, not just religious observance that we do just to please somebody, a parent or a priest or whoever or a pastor. Jesus said, no more of that. I want a relationship. No more just arbitrary rules that you get from other places. But in this via crucis, in this way of suffering that we're going to see, and I hope that you'll continue on this journey as we go through this up until Easter, what we're going to see is that Jesus Christ is no religious person. He is no guru. He is, as Mark said, he is the one and only Lord and the only name under which we can be saved by. And he is wanting a real relationship with us. I know I can't just like snap my fingers and have you just forget about any of these, experiences you might have had with church or religion or Christianity or whatever that was just all about rules. I wish I could just, help you just get rid of it. But I understand those hurdles are hard to get over. But would you just hear me say that Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. He wants a relationship with you. And he is not just all about keeping religious rules. And I don't know about you, but that's one of the best things that I have heard in a long, long time.